Good afternoon and welcome to K-12 Budget Committee. Today at Special Education, I would like for us to have a review of the funding, what's included, what's not. We also have Craig here and John. If there are additional questions, I'm sure they would be willing to come and answer those questions. So first, we're going to have Gabrielle walk us through it. Gabrielle, we did include this little addition too. And I think this may have come from John a long time. It didn't?
I think that was actually a post audit. I think it's a 2018 legislative post audit.
Wait a minute, I printed that's the wrong thing. Throw that away. Well, do we have the copy? I feel like the one that I showed you that one time? No? You don't know what I'm talking about?
No.
There's a one-pager that goes through and actually shows everything, how you figure it. And I'm going to bring this up again because this is kind of what I want. Maybe John, so basically what you start with your total amount from the previous year. You add your teachers, the number of percent increase for your teachers, and then whatever other items, and then it helps you calculate it all the way down. And maybe it came from Craig. Craig, does that sound familiar? Because that is how we used it to see. And I'm really bummed that I haven't been able to locate mine, but that's kind of what I'm looking for. But let's go through it and see. And then from there, Craig, maybe what you can do is help us go backward with using last year's numbers. And we put that at the top and then walk us through what that formula would look like. And I feel like it was like a box and a rectangle and, okay. All right, go ahead. Thank you, Gabrielle.
My memo, it sounds like my memo is a little bit more broad on how special education funding is calculated. So there is a section on the first page covering special education state aid. Current law does provide for special education state aid in the form of reimbursements for excess costs associated with providing special education services. Those include but aren't limited to Medicaid replacement state aid, catastrophic aid, transportation aid, and special education teacher aid, which I believe the chair referenced. KSA 72-3422 sets the reimbursement rate for special education state aid, that is also called categorical aid, at 92% of total state excess costs, but provides for prorating state aid if the appropriation for special education state aid does not equal 92% of excess costs. In any year when the appropriation for special education state aid is not sufficient to cover that 92%, state aid is distributed at a prorated amount for special education teacher aid. There's also federal aid for special education, and on the next page you'll see an overview of IDEA funding. The first page also includes an overview of special education and related services weighting. That's included in the Kansas School Equity and Enhancement Act. It's calculated by dividing the amount of special education state aid a district receives by the base aid for student excellence, or the base state aid, for the current school year. The resulting quotient of that equation is a special education weighting, and that is added to a school district's full-time equivalent enrollment. The weighting does not increase the amount of state foundation aid a district is entitled to. The amount of special education state aid a district receives is defined as local foundation aid. The value of the weighting is deducted when computing a district's state foundation aid entitlement. And I will note special education students may also be eligible for other weightings such as at-risk or bilingual education. The next page offers, again, that brief overview of federal funding. That's the Federal Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA, and that requires states to provide special education services to children with disabilities between the ages of 3 and 21. That includes children with developmental delays, hearing or visual impairments, emotional disturbance, or autism. And IDEA requires each special education student to receive an individualized education plan, or an IEP, that identifies the services to be provided to that student. State law closely mirrors federal law, but does impose some additional special education requirements on school districts. And those are listed on page 2. They include identifying and providing services to gifted students, using interventions in the regular education classroom before referring a student to special education, and providing special education services to children who reside in the district but attend a private school. And there is also a brief overview of COVID-19 IDEA funding. I won't read through that whole portion, but is worth mentioning that there was dedicated funding through COVID-19 relief. The following pages do show a breakdown of the past several fiscal years of special education services state aid. And there's a graph that helps illustrate the portions of state aid that go to different categories, such as teacher entitlement, transportation aid, catastrophic aid, and Medicaid reimbursement. And I'm happy to stand for questions.
All right, thank you, Gabrielle. That's great. Let's take a look at that page that you put together, the Special Education Service State Aid, and maybe if we could walk through that. The teachers, the regular teachers, is there a specific % increase each year for teachers that's calculated? So we added 586 teachers from 2020 to 2021. But then the year before, it's 67.
Not sure, I know off the top of my head, the breakdown of the teacher entitlement increases year over year, but that's certainly something that if Craig doesn't have the answer to, we could get that to you.
We'll have Craig walk us through some of the like how you would compute it.
Sure.
Questions for Gabrielle that are not about the formula.
Broadly, though, I can explain special education teacher aid, but the increases in teachers, I may not be able to reference just from these specific fiscal years without some more information, but I can go over broadly that category of aid.
Sure.
So school districts receive funding based on district total special education teacher and para FTE staffing levels. So paras are counted at a 0.4 FTE, and a special education teacher at the Kansas State School for the Blind or Kansas State School for the Deaf is paid by the school district and is considered a special education teacher of the school district for the purpose of determining that special education state aid a district is to receive for special education teachers. So they may be able to speak specifically to increases in special education teachers over time, but that's broadly how it's calculated.
I'm going to open it up for questions for Gabrielle. Representative Tarwater.
Just a clarification on the numbers were under teacher entitlement, regular teachers. Those are dollars. Those aren't number of teachers, right?
Those are teachers for under the, in the first portion, it's the, Craig may be able to better explain this, how a teacher FTE equates to our equation, but do you want to take that one, Craig? Sure.
Okay, well, let's have Craig come on up. Craig, you have the handout that we have. Maybe we can work from that first, and you can answer Representative Tarwater's question. Because yes, I thought it was the number of teachers, because it says total number of teachers, regular teachers. That's in the middle column. On the right-hand column, that's dollars, perhaps.
Yes. On the,
Thank you, John. That'll help too. So on the Special Education Services State Aid, under teacher entitlement, it is talking about how many FTE teachers are there, special education teachers. And as Gabrielle said, paras are referred to as teacher aides on this printout. And for funding purposes, they are counted as a 0.4 FTE. So you total those numbers up, and the total number of teachers that shows here, for instance, and I'll just look at the first column, in 1819, 13,858.70. That's the number of teachers. The entitlement per teacher, 30,085, is a dollar amount. That's how much the district receives for each FTE teacher. So if our math is correct on the sheet, 13,858.7 times 30,085 gives us $416,938,989.
So does that mean the total number of Representative Tarr, does that mean the total number of teachers here is including already the teacher aides at 0.4 within that total number?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And so you're just kind of, okay, so that's, Representative Tarwater?
Okay, and so the dollar figure of, in 2021 of 31,465, is that additional to what they're paid, or is that what they're paid?
No, that's the share of their salary that the state provides, is one way to look at it. That they're still paid a negotiated amount with each school district. State aid, do you mind a little longer answer on this, Madam Chair? Okay. So the whole process, in somewhat of a nutshell, the legislature appropriates a specific amount of money for special education state aid. And that covers special education transportation, has to be required for special education. Catastrophic costs, which is the cost for students with really high needs, and that's defined in statute what that really high need is. There is a Medicaid replacement piece that's about $9 million every year, and then the rest is used to cover what we call categorical aid, which is the cost per teacher that you're looking at here. So we start with the appropriation that the legislature makes, and you see that down on the bottom of Gabrielle's sheet in bold type, State General Fund. So in the year you referenced in 2021, it was $505,416,348. So when we're calculating the per teacher amount, we start with the 505. Districts tell us the transportation that they had for the year, and by statute, 80% of that is reimbursed to them. So we take that cost out of the 505 million. Then they report, and you see that also on Gabrielle's sheet. You can see the section for transportation aid, 69,440,451. So we would subtract that out of the 505 million. The catastrophic aid, the high cost for special ed students, you can see that for 2021 was 864,553. We subtract that off. Medicaid reimbursement was 8.9 million, just under $9 million. We subtract that out. The remaining amount is what you see under the teacher entitlement of $434,509,939. And then using that number and the total number of teachers, 13,809.31, we actually back into the entitlement per teacher. So that entitlement per teacher is going to vary every year. That's why you see that number changing like it is with seemingly no rhyme or reason, depending on how many teachers you have, depending on what the transportation costs were, depending on what the catastrophic costs were. That's actually the last number that gets determined in paying state aid for special education. So one thing I'll point out, in 2020, 2021, last year, you see the entitlement per teacher increased compared to the prior year. The two reasons for that, primary one being total number of teachers actually decreased. Schools faced the same issue with hiring as all our other businesses did. There just weren't enough people to hire, so they actually had fewer, which does not happen often in special education. So that's why the amount per teacher increased. So that's the way districts then are funded. And their categorical aid, they tell us how many, each district then, or actually co-op or interlocal, will tell us how many FTE teachers they have. We multiply that by the 31,465, and that tells us how much money they're due. And then they use that to cover their special education costs. So it's not necessarily a salary that's going to the teacher. That's just the way that the aid is calculated. Maybe that's a little clearer.
Representative Tarwater and then Representative Estes.
Thanks for clearing that up. But then how do you get to the percent of excess cost at the very bottom of 73.2%?
Okay, that's a different calculation, and I think that's the sheet that the chair was referring to. And I have a copy here with my handwritten notes scratched all over it, so I can walk you through that process, and then we can get a copy of that sheet for the committee's benefit. So to determine excess cost, and the chair started down this path, we start with what the districts actually spend last year on special education. And just to give you an idea, a year ago, it was $1,017,356,000 and a little extra. So a little over $1 billion. That's the total that was spent on special education. And this is all spelled out in a statute, what you count, what you don't count. And when I say we, this is determined by a consensus group that meets in the fall, which consists of the State Department of Education, KLRD, and the Division of the Budget. And we go through all these numbers until we agree. So $1 billion, a little over, were the costs. From that, then, we're trying to decide what are they going to spend this year, in all likelihood. So we add an increase for how much our salary is going to grow. What's the typical percentage of a raise that's given? We add that onto what they spent last year. And then how many teachers are going to be added this year, which is obviously an estimate too. So that FTE teachers that you're looking at on this chart, we increase that number by how many are going to be added. Most years, when you're not having a hiring issue, that's going to be close to 300 between teachers and paras. So we increase the amount by those two figures, percent of salary increase and the number of teachers. Then from that new total, you subtract what do you spend for a, quote, traditional student? What does schools spend on average? And then multiply that by the number of special education students. So when you're talking about excess cost, it's excess over how much? Well, that's the how much. What do you typically spend on that student anyway for the traditional education? So we take the number of special education students times the average cost that's spent on a student to provide their general education. Subtract that out. We also subtract out federal aid. So any federal money that is paid to school districts for special education gets subtracted out. Just for information, that's in the neighborhood of $130 million. We subtract out Medicaid reimbursements. Interlocals and co-ops receive some reimbursements for special education services that are Medicaid funded. And then there's a little bit that state hospitals have for administrative costs that gets subtracted out. So after subtracting all those amounts, we're left with a final dollar amount, which this year was in the neighborhood of $671 million. That's the excess cost. What's it cost to provide special education above the traditional cost for those 29,000 students that have an IEP? We compare the $671 million with the appropriation that was made, which was $513 million. I'm sorry, I skipped a step. So we got $671 million. 92% of that is $618 million. So if you're going to cover 92% of excess costs, we need 618. We have 513. So if you divide that by the 670, that tells us we're covering 76.4%. And for this year, just for information purposes, when we talk about federal aid that we subtract out, we included the ESSER funds that were dedicated for special education. So the federal aid is a little bit higher this year and next year than what it typically is. That's a lot when you don't have the numbers to look at.
You know, that's kind of, so to kind of explain, that's kind of what I'm looking for. A document like and I know, I feel like the department's provided this for us
I
before.
believe you're correct.
And it actually helps, and we could actually take the numbers that you gave us, because you actually referenced 513 million, and mine says 520 million, so I'm not sure where that came from. Probably my error in following it. But if we could get a document like that, because, for example, what percentage did you do for pay increases?
For the current year, 4.
4%.
And we can send you a copy of this, what I was reading from right here.
Yes, but I mean, if you can actually create it
Yes, it'll
like
have all
that.
those numbers on it.
Yes, that shows how we get it, divide it. That helps us understand it a lot.
When the consensus estimate group goes through it, they calculate it for the current year, which were the numbers I was reading, for the following year and the second following year. So you'll have all 3 of those on that.
When you were talking about the 130 million, the average cost for students, I think you mentioned 130 million. Are you taking the enrollment times the base state aid plus weightings, or how are you getting the 130 million? And how many students are enrolled in special education?
Okay, IEP students are approximately 29,000. The average cost per pupil, that calculation again is spelled out in statute. You start with the base, and then there are a few selected weightings that are added. And that comes up then this year, the current year, $7,909.
Uh-huh, 7,000.
7909.
Okay, so question about that, because what's the average per pupil cost across the board? I thought it was around 16,000.
That's for everything. So capital outlay, bond and interest, food service. This is just looking at providing the educational cost in the classroom.
Okay. Okay, so then that number is how you derive the 130 million that you referenced?
I'm trying to see where I've got 130 million.
You said,
We've got, if I said 130, I was off. We're showing close to 230 million for the current year for, federal aid is about 130 million. And that's just the flat amount. How much did they send us?
okay, so I'm pretty sure that you'll be able to add all of that into your sheet, and then that'll be easier. That's very helpful. Representative Estes, and then Representative Owsley.
Okay. Mike, I'm still wanting to make sure that I'm breaking everything down on the chart right. Regular teachers, FY 2018 to 2019, 8,354. Are those IEP teachers?
Those are strictly special education teachers.
Okay. And for purposes of the formula, did I understand that when you create that entitlement per teacher, you're adding in teacher aides?
Yes.
And
They're
do they
adding-
carry the same weight as an IEP teacher? Or,
No, they don't. One para counts as 0.4.
okay, thank you.
Certainly.
I appreciate the clarification.
Okay, and just a note on that, Representative Estes, if you look on that, the total number of teachers under the regular teachers, teacher's aid, if you take those and you use the 0.4, you get that last figure. And then you multiply it by 30,085, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. And could you refresh my memory on a non-public equivalency?
I think I can get this pretty accurate. Private schools don't always provide the service. They may contract with the public school to provide the service, in which case the teacher may be funded through the public school, and they don't show up in the other counts, so they're funded in the non-public equivalency, or that's how they're counted.
Which actually goes to my next question, because last year there was a lot of conversation about when a student enrolled in private school is receiving IEP services, that whether or not the money was following the child for that. What can you clarify for me on that?
I'll probably be fuzzy, but the service can still be provided, as I said, sometimes by the public school. Sometimes a private school will provide it. The funding, obviously, if the public school provides it, the funding is provided just as it is here. I can't tell you specifically how it flows to the private school, if it does, or if we just allowed, like other federal funds, just to pay for a service rather than provide the money to the private school.
I'm going to step in real quick on that because we did talk about that last year and you went through it for us. And what you shared with us last year, and I know it's confusing, but you said you can't directly take any type of special education federal funds and give it to a private school. So it has to go to the public school and service can be provided or a charge can be made, but the money doesn't go directly to schools. And then another thing that you shared with us last year was an email. We should probably find it because because there was a lot of confusion in the committee and you helped clear it up. The other thing that he shared was that the district that child comes from, that's that special education, they still receive base state aid for that child, even if they go to the private school. But they're required they get special education funding for that child. They count them for that. They are required to provide that service since that private school cannot do that.
And thank you, because that's what I wanted to make sure that you were getting funding for that. So I appreciate
Yes, if the
that.
public school is providing the service, they are being funded for it.
Okay, thank you.
And I always need a refresher, but you really helped us out a lot last year on that one. So Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Craig. I'll see if I can make sense of this. So the percentage excess cost, it says fiscal year 2020, 2021, we're at 73.2%. And on the front page of the KLRD, it says that KSA 72-3422 says the state should be at 92.0%. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, sir.
And then, do you know what districts do to make up that percentage that the state is lacking in their statutory obligations?
Excuse me, the districts have to make up that difference from their general fund or their LOB because, and you've talked about this before as well, the services are required. So if there's not enough special education funding, the district can't say, well, we won't provide this program or that program next year. The service is required both in state and federal statute. So that it's not an option to not fund it. You just have to find it from other programs in your general fund or your LOB.
And that state general fund would typically be earmarked for other purposes other than special ed, because that by design, the state should be meeting that 92%.
That's correct.
And then maybe a question for the revisor. If the state is out of its obligation or out of compliance with statute, is there any enforcement statute for 723422?
I don't believe so. I think the state has been under that 92% threshold for quite some time now, and you probably would have heard about an enforcement mechanism if there was one.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you all.
Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So for clarification on the enrollment, the students receiving the services plan services, they would be dual enrolled, public and private school, and they would be counted by the September 20th count date at the public school.
That's correct.
Okay, and then they can contract with a private school to do those. That's where I'm not sure.
Private school then would need to contract with the public school to provide those services, those special education services.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, so another question here. I'm looking at it. Am I reading this correct? And Gabrielle can help us. The governor put in her budget a 1.36% increase from last year. Is that right? From 513 million to 520 million? Maybe somebody could do the math. Or somebody could
Madam
just do
Chair,
the
the
math.
legislature has appropriated an additional $7.5 million each year for, when did that start? Yes. 17. Began in 17 and then next year is the last year that it's built into the budget.
Right, so,
That's where that 7.5 million is coming from legislative appropriations. Am I answering the wrong question?
well, so I'm just looking at this special education funding piece of it. It says, we haven't reviewed the KSDE budget yet, but it says 520 million. And from the previous, actually, I guess I should be using the 505, correct? Not 513. I'm trying to do percent change from last year to this year. No, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm trying to do percent change from last year, 2021, to this year. I'll do it real quick. This is important. Else have a question while I do that? Representative Owsley.
Thank you. While we're trying to figure out how to do math, I was trying to also, if we're at, for 2020, 2021 actual, 505, 416, 348 at 73.2%, do we know the number, the dollar amount that would be 92%?
For the current year to increase to 92% for 21, 22, we would need $105 million. If you're looking at next year, 22, 23, that grows to $155 million.
Okay, and then I guess that kind of, if I'm reading this chart right, the state general fund, it appears to be going down in the percentage. You know, we were at 81 and 19 and 75 and 20 and 73 and 21, estimated for 22 at 68, and then it appears like we're given less and less. So that 105 million will be a growing number as we get further away from that 92%, if I said all that in a clear manner.
That's correct.
Thank you.
So let's continue along that line of thought and kind of go backwards here. So the governor's budget put in $513 million this year. Is that correct? But that's what she put in her budget? Okay, based on caseloads and everything. Okay, last year it was 505. So the 7 million plus that is the difference. So that's just over 1% increase. What was the percent increase for regular general ed?
I don't know totals. The base increased 3%. But what the total in the general fund increased, I don't know because I don't have the weighted FTEs and so forth in front of me.
And so for these students, so it's interesting because in the past few years, the governor has recommended the budget with just this little increase for special education. And I think some of the information that we've received is that each of these students are calculated for an increase, just like every other student for their base state aid. And they're getting additional weightings that are multiplied from that increase of the base state aid, which is around $130 or so approximately each year. So they're getting that increase. It's not counted for the special education. You subtract it from it. So it's subtracted from it, but it's still there. So they are still getting an increase in that pot of money. It's not this pot of money. And so talk about a little bit about, we know that the 92% is a statute put in by the legislature, and that we haven't met it. In 2012 was the last time we met it. Was that federal funds that allowed us to meet it, or does anyone recall?
That involved ARRA, federal funds.
Okay, so Gabrielle, you can double check this, or Craig, or John. The only time that we met it since we put the statute in place was in a year or a group of years in which we received federal funds?
Actually, 2 years prior to that, the state met it on its own.
Okay, so 3 years?
We met it in, I wanted to say 10, 11. I may be Okay, 10, 11 with ARRA funds. 2 years before that, the state met it on its own. The year in between, we were not at 92%.
Okay, so let's try to understand what are the variables that cause that number, as Representative Owsley said, go down, that percentage that we're hitting. As Bay State aid increases, how does that affect that number? And then also talk to us about the federal maintenance of effort. What is that percentage? Is the federal government meeting its maintenance of effort? Give us a little bit of information on that.
Okay. So what goes into the percentage declining? For starters, remember the total expenditures in special education are a little over $1 billion. So when we increase funding every year for special education by $7.5 million, that's about 0.75%, more or less. When we increase the base by 3% each year, then all else being equal, which it never is, but all else being equal, and if you ignore enrollment growth and everything else, districts are going to be able to give about a 3% raise to their teachers. Well, special ed co-ops are receiving the money for special education, which is a 0.75%. So they're not going to be able to keep up with a 3% raise. So that's part of the difference. Then you noticed we keep adding teachers every year. Needs for students grow. More students require services. The services they require are more intensive, which requires more teachers and more paras. So the number of teachers and paras grows. So even though money has been added to special education, the costs have grown faster. And that's why the percentage keeps getting further away from 92 in a short version.
Okay, and so real quick, and then let others jump in here, because I don't want to beat this to death, but we've got 29,000 students that are receiving special education services. If we were to look a decade back, what would that enrollment number be?
I don't know that, but I could find out very quickly, actually.
And then when you're looking at that, I would love to maybe understand what's causing this increase. Is it the way we're defining it? Because you mentioned services include behavioral, and I don't know, I'm sure that probably has always been part of it. But what is the area that we're finding an increase? And is this a trend that we should continue to watch and monitor? All right, committee, other questions?
Can I back up? You asked
Yes.
about maintenance of effort?
Yes, thank you.
So the maintenance of effort, short version says, when the federal government increases funding, they want state and local funding to increase also. In other words, they don't want their increase being used to just reduce what we paid locally. So that's what maintenance of effort is about for special education in the short version. So school districts have to watch each year to make sure that the state and local expenditures that they make are at least equal to what they spent last year. Otherwise, they risk, the whole state actually risks losing special education federal dollars.
Great point. So it comes back to last year when KSDE gave some COVID dollars for special education. That was 20-some million. How much was that?
From ESSER 2, well, let me back up. ESSER 1 was $8 million. That's mostly been drawn down and spent. This is out of the set-aside money that the state board had available. ESSER 2, they identified $24 million, but it was split up in two payments. One $12 million intended to help this year, another $12 million intended to help next year, so that there wouldn't be quite such a cliff to fall off when that money's gone. That is considered federal money, so it does not add to the state and local costs, and it won't detract from the state and local costs then when it's gone.
That was what I was going to ask, so that's good to know. Okay, any other questions? So basically, once you add to the pot, you're never going to go backwards.
There are a few regulations basically built into the federal that allow you to reduce. So if your student number's reduced, then you can reduce the number of teachers you have, and that will obviously reduce your costs. So there are some ways to reduce your costs, but it's not, you can't do it like you do in regular education where times are tough when we had the recession back in 2008, 2009. You had to cut programs, you had to cut staff in a lot of different areas. You're typically not going to be able to do that in special education. You
Okay.
can imagine that causes some concern for school districts.
Okay, so this committee, we will have an opportunity in a few weeks, actually, very soon, maybe 2 weeks, Gabrielle, I believe. We'll be going over our Kansas Department of Education budget. The special education, of course, will be part of that. Remember, it is the governor's recommendation just to add just a little over 1% increase. And so that's something that if anyone wants to provide testimony, they can certainly do so on any of the items that are found in our budget. So thank you very much for helping us try to understand it, and hopefully we'll remember it better next year. Any other items for the good of the committee? Am I forgetting anything? Holly, Nick, Gabrielle? No? All right. Have a great evening. We are adjourned.